A woman is teaching an enslaved child his letters in a Baltimore house. And when her husband stops it, his reasons tell you something the whip never could. Institutions confess what they fear through what they forbid. So no, this isn't an inspiring story about a boy who learned to read. The ban is the evidence. The inspiration is evidence for the prosecution. And it ends at an estate appraisal where children are priced beside the livestock. One question: what did slavery need more than the whip to survive? And why did the master's own words give the whole system away? The Aulds' home stands in Fells Point, Baltimore, on Aliciana Street, close by the shipyards, and Hugh Auld is chasing his ambition to build ships and a name in that city of shipbuilding. The child is Frederick Bailey, not yet 10 years old by his own telling, sent in from a Maryland plantation to mind the Aulds' little son, Tommy. And the woman is Sophia Auld, who, as Douglas describes her, had not yet learned to treat a child as property. He suggests the lecture she is about to get from her husband was probably the first time anyone explained the rules to her. Her new charge hears her reading the Bible aloud, asks her to teach him, and she says yes, just like that. She's proud of him too. Douglas remembers her telling her husband with open pride how quick her pupil was, and that she meant to keep teaching him. And Hugh Auld stops the lesson cold. Here's the strange part. In the scene Douglas records, Auld answers with a prohibition and an argument. Douglas describes no physical violence in this exchange. He gives his wife a whole lecture on why this one small kindness is the most dangerous thing happening in his house. Douglas preserved that speech, and you'll hear its key sentences in a few minutes in the words he remembered Auld by, because it is one of the most revealing renderings of slaveholding logic we have. One slaveholder, in Douglas's remembered account, explaining what the system feared. One sentence of it you can have now, as Douglas preserved it. Auld said, quote, "He should know nothing but the will of his master and learn to obey it," end quote. And, in paraphrase, he warned that the teaching was unlawful, unsafe, and that learning would forever unfit the boy for the duties of a slave. Unfit, not disobedient, not dangerous, unfit. As if slavery were a container and a reading mind simply stops fitting inside it. Sit with how strange that is. In these same pages, an overseer named Austin Gore shoots a man named Denby dead where he stands, neck deep in a creek, and is never punished for it. Douglas's memoir puts those two kinds of power inside one system: deadly violence and the policing of reading. And in his telling, it was the reading lesson, not any act of defiance, that drew the lecture. The system needed control of knowledge alongside its force, and Auld knew it. So what did he know exactly? To understand what Auld gave away in that house, you have to see what the system had already taken from this boy before anyone opened a book. Frederick Bailey was born in Tuckahoe, Talbot County, Maryland. He could not tell his own age, later supposed he had been born about 1817, and writes that he never met a slave who could tell his own age. He's raised by his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, in a log hut of clay, wood, and straw. And that arrangement wasn't mercy. Douglas calls it what it was: the system's common practice. Douglas lays the practice out plainly. Children separated from their mothers, the mothers hired out at distances too great for visiting. He calls it a marked feature of the system he was born into, and the charge he builds from it is this: ownership decided who could stay near whom, which means ownership decided what one generation could hand to the next. Whether or not any single master thought of it as strategy, the effect was structural. Teaching, care, memory, all of it made unreliable. All of it hanging on another man's account book. His mother, Harriet Bailey, was a field hand, hired out about 12 miles away. He knew her as a face arriving after dark. The book says she was obliged to cover the 12 miles each way between nightfall and daybreak, and her visits, as he remembers them, were few, brief, and almost always at night. And when she died, he was still a small boy. What stood between them through her whole illness, he names with one image: a gulf, impassable, made of slavery. And then there's the detail that should stop you. Douglas wrote, quote, "I learned after my mother's death that she could read, and that she was the only one of all the slaves and colored people in Tuckahoe who enjoyed that advantage," end quote. The only reader, Douglas specifies, among all the slaves and colored people of Tuckahoe, in his phrase. And her son never knew it while she lived. What that fact proves, and what it doesn't. Her literacy did not free her from enslavement. She was a field hand, and she died enslaved. Her son got his letters from other hands, in another city, and learned only after she was gone that she had them to give. So knowledge alone was rescuing no one here. Which doesn't answer our question. It sharpens it. If reading couldn't free his mother, why did a grown man in Baltimore treat a child's spelling lesson like a fire in the shipyard? Going back to the Auld house and the debt we owe you from the opening. A warning first. The words Douglas attributes to Auld include the slur of the era. I'm going to read them as Douglas preserved them, once, because the sentences tell us precisely what slavery feared. Douglas wrote that Auld said, quote, "If you give a nigger an inch, he will take an L," end quote. And then this, quote, "If you learn him now to read, he'll want to know how to write. And, this accomplished, he'll be running away with himself," end quote. Read that back slowly. Remember the question we left Tuckahoe with: why a spelling lesson gets treated like a fire in the shipyard. Auld just answered it. He never once claims the boy is incapable. Every clause assumes the opposite. Give him an inch, he'll take the L, an old unit of length many times the inch. The fear is exponential. Teach him to read, he'll want to write. Let him write, and he'll carry himself off. That is not the language of inert property. It's the language of a system trying to control a person it calls property, an inventory of what a mind might do. Auld isn't saying the boy can't grow. He's saying the boy must not grow, because judgment, ambition, the ability to move ideas between people, those are exactly the abilities the system has to crush if it wants to keep a human being usable as property. And don't let the psychology hide the practical side. Years later, back on the Eastern Shore, this book shows forged protections written in Frederick's own hand, for himself and the rest, at the center of a failed escape plot. The forgeries make Auld's read, write, run sequence chillingly concrete. His real escape came in September 1838, and its method he deliberately withholds. Reading was material power, and Auld knew it. Now the strongest objection, in its strongest form. This scene comes from a practiced orator, writing the second version of his own life, roughly 3 decades on. Maybe the remembered speech is sharpened for effect. A fair suspicion. No independent record of the conversation survives in our sources. What the record shows is the same core anecdote recurring in Douglas's own retellings. The 1845 narrative carries it: the inch, the L, the unfitness. An excerpt from his December 1850 Rochester lecture, included in the book's appended materials, carries it again, this time with the value language explicit. And lecturing there, Douglas said the South understood the principle perfectly well. Schooling the enslaved bred exactly the discontent the system could not absorb. A reader in 1855 also met this book as the second telling, written as Douglas pushed beyond the role some early abolitionist allies urged on him. Supply the facts, he was told, and leave the philosophy to others. It is still his memory of a household argument, not a transcript. And notice the first objection Auld raised, as Douglas reports it, before any philosophy. He framed the lesson as unlawful. Then he explained the logic indoors. The boy standing in that room heard it the same way. Douglas says the speech was the first decidedly anti-slavery lecture he ever heard. His master had accidentally taught him the one thing the system most needed him never to learn, that his ignorance wasn't a fact of nature. It was a project, maintained on purpose, at cost. So he treated the prohibition as a map. Over his years in Baltimore, he paid what he called his tuition fee to his young white playmates in the streets, and bread he carried in his pocket, a lesson for a single biscuit. He kept a Webster spelling book in that same pocket. At about 13, with money he had made himself, he paid 50 cents at Knight's shop on Thames Street for a book of speeches called The Columbian Orator. In the shipyard, he copied the letters carpenters marked on timber: S for starboard, L for larboard. Board fences and pavements were his copybooks, a lump of chalk his pen and ink. And here's what made the speech land so hard. The boy had already begun this arithmetic back on the plantation, before Baltimore, a child asking why these people were slaves at all. Looking back as a writer, Douglas reconstructs the deduction his younger self had worked out. He wrote, quote, "It was not color, but crime, not God, but man, that afforded the true explanation of the existence of slavery. Nor was I long in finding out another important truth, viz., what man can make, man can unmake." End quote. What man can make, man can unmake. That's a child's deduction that the entire institution around him is a built thing, and built things come down. The household speech didn't plant that idea. It confirmed it and handed him the method. But before this becomes the triumph you're expecting, Douglas interrupts it himself. The knowledge tormented him. He says learning to read made him, at first, more miserable, not less, because, as he puts it, it opened his eyes to the horrible pit and opened no way for his escape. Learning made freedom imaginable. It did not make his mother free, and it hadn't yet moved him 1 foot toward his own. For Douglas, literacy became a route toward freedom, not a guarantee. That limit doesn't weaken the question, it explains the fear. If reading were harmless to the system, the ban is senseless. If reading alone reliably delivered freedom, his mother's life is hard to explain. What Auld feared sits exactly between. What reading builds upstream of any escape, the judgment, as I read Douglas, that makes a person impossible to rule. Now watch what happens to the teacher, because this might be the book's hardest argument. Sophia Auld didn't shrug and move on after her husband's lecture. She converted. Douglas tells us she became, in time, even more violent against his learning than Auld himself, snatching newspapers out of his hands, policing his corners and his silences. When you reach those pages, the instinct is to file her under cruelty and move on. Douglas won't let you. He names the mechanism instead, the fatal poison of irresponsible power. Douglas's reading is severe and precise. The role required her to stop seeing a child, and the requirement did its work. Douglas wrote, quote, "Nature had made us friends. Slavery made us enemies." End quote. He's careful here, and we should be too. This is not an excuse. The woman who once bragged to her husband about her pupil became, in time, an active enforcer of the prohibition, of the very rule that had been read to her. Conditioning explains her. It doesn't acquit her. But Douglas keeps his aim on the institution that trained her, because he'd already seen the same engine at work back on Colonel Lloyd's plantation, where the machinery had less polish. Out there, truth itself was policed. Douglas tells of an enslaved man stopped on the road by a stranger who asked how his master treated him. The man answered honestly. The stranger was Colonel Lloyd, his owner, and weeks later the man was sold to a Georgia trader, torn from his family with no warning at all. Stories like that one taught enslaved people to give the safe answer: contentment, a kind master. And Douglas adds a detail that cuts deeper than a lie would. He says such answers didn't even feel utterly false, because kindness was being measured on slavery's own scale. The system needed the enslaved unlettered, and it needed them unheard, and it had procedures for both. And Douglas, writing about the world of his childhood, hands down the verdict early. He wrote, quote, "The slaveholder, as well as the slave, is the victim of the slave system," end quote. A system that has to destroy the kindness of its own administrators just to keep running is telling you something about what it runs on. Not temperament, procedure. And every procedure we've seen has a destination. When the old master, Captain Anthony, died without a will, the boy was sent back from Baltimore to be counted. All the property of the estate gathered in one place to be valued and divided between the heirs. Douglas stood with the horses, the sheep, and the swine to be inspected and priced, and he wrote down what it made of everyone there. Quote, "Horses and men, cattle and women, pigs and children, all holding the same rank in the scale of social existence. Personality swallowed up in the sordid idea of property. Manhood lost in chattelhood," end quote. The people waiting on the result, he says, had no more voice in it than the oxen chewing at the haymow. Here's where every thread ends. Back in Tuckahoe, I said teaching, care, and memory hung on another man's ledger, and that was a figure of speech. This is the ledger logic made visible, an appraisal, where ownership recorded what the lash enforced. Separation was enforceable because people were entries, and the law made the entries hereditary. The child's condition followed the mother's. Honest speech was dangerous because an entry that complains gets sold. Education was suspect because an entry that reads can stop being an entry. Years later, when his grandmother Betsy Bailey, the devoted mother of 12 children, the woman who had rocked her old master in his own infancy, had grown too old to work, her owners at the time, judging her worth nearly spent, moved her to a hut in the woods with a mud chimney and granted her, in the book's acid phrasing, the privilege of full self-support in perfect loneliness. Turned out to die. Douglas's account of that abandonment describes no whipping. It didn't need one. So what did slavery need more than the whip? Douglas's whole childhood keeps answering: control. The very thing the whip existed to secure. Over what could be learned, what could be passed on, what could be said out loud. The whip enforced all of it. The reasons lived elsewhere, in rules and warnings like Auld's, and Auld's mistake was saying one out loud where a child could hear him. Not because reading alone guaranteed freedom, it did not, but because reading built judgment, carried plans between people, and widened the real possibility of freeing yourself. The ban, as Douglas reads it, is the place where the system said its own weakness out loud, in words a boy could memorize. Which means the easiest shelf for this book is the wrong shelf. A comfortable reading calls it an inspiring literacy story, a kind mistress, a gifted boy, reading as rescue. That reading is not just thin, it is close to a format Douglas increasingly resisted because it restricted him to testimony when he wanted also to argue, facts from him, philosophy from his early abolitionist colleagues. That was the advice given to the lecturer, And this second telling of his life is the argument delivered at full voice. And the argument is a prosecution. The triumph is real. Every inspiring beat in it exists because a system made learning the alphabet require heroism. Read it warm, and you miss what the book is doing. Read it as the argument it is, and the warmth survives anyway. But the book leaves you holding a contradiction, and it's a sharp one. Douglas himself says the gift for words in him came down from his mother, from what he calls her native genius, and not from the white paternity the world would have credited. Her literacy did not free her, and Douglas calls literacy a pathway first, then refuses to sentimentalize what it cost. The torment came with the knowledge, and for years it opened no way out. Being able to read the lock doesn't hand you the key, and that question isn't antique. In December 2025, Arkansas's Corrections Board approved a policy barring people incarcerated in its state prisons from receiving books, newspapers, or magazines by direct mail, publisher orders included. The board cited contraband concerns. Critics in the reporting disputed whether the incidents justified the reach. Bulk donations to prison libraries would have stayed allowed, and as of late January 2026, the restriction was on hold for formal rulemaking, with the state's online rule code, a page last updated July 9, 2026, still listing publications from recognized outlets as permitted, subject to inspection. That is where the record stands. A stated security reason deserves the same reading Auld's reasons got. That is, not slavery, and nobody here says it is. But one question survives the difference, the one this book presses on the present. Who decides what a confined person may read? So here's where I land, and you should test me on it. If Douglas is right that the ban was the system revealing itself, then what an institution forbids is a place to start reading its fears. Not proof on its own, a place to start. And sometimes, as in the Auld house, the gate explains itself out loud. But there's a real rival reading. Auld was protecting an investment, economics, with no admission in it. And the book's own record refuses to let me dismiss it. In this 1855 telling, the phrase is running away with himself, and I read self-possession in it, theft, in the master's grammar, where the thing stolen is the self. In the 1850 lecture, excerpted in the book's appended materials, the economic logic is explicit. Douglas recalls Auld declaring that he was ruined, his value as a slave destroyed. Hold both versions. Let me try to say the link precisely. The way I hear those two formulations, they are linked. A slave's price and a slave's ownership of himself read like one line in the account book, seen from opposite sides. And in Auld's telling, the investment was only safe while the mind inside it stayed unable to read. To my ear, the economics doesn't defeat the confession. It signs it. And if you think plain self-interest explains Auld with no confession in it at all, that is the strongest standing objection to this episode, and I'd rather leave it standing than pretend it's settled. Test that against the book and tell me where you land. In part 2 rewinds, years before that September night, to the boy, no longer a child, sent to a man named Edward Covey, whose chapter in this book carries a title that needs no explaining. Covey, the Negro Breaker. What happens there is part 2.